really happy to be here. I grew up in Argentina by the Paraná River, and very early in my life I learned to value water, not just quantity and quality, but because of flooding and the impact that flooding had on people's life. So when the time came to go to college, I decided to study a new field, which was water resources engineering. And a while back then, I decided to pursue studies abroad and came to the US, to the University of Minnesota, thinking that I was going to be there for only a couple of years and then go back, and ended up being a little bit more than that, and it's more like 30 now. So what I want to talk to you about is the Chicago River, and in particular, I think it's very important to follow history and why we are where we are, particularly in the case of Chicago. Chicago and the river and the lake they have had this interaction for many, many years, and Lake Michigan being the main source of water for us. Sometimes we take it for granted because it looks huge, so we think that there is going to be water forever, but in reality that's not the case. So what I want to do is, you don't need to see this, but I think it's important to remember that we are part of something that is called the Great Lakes, and where Chicago is located is at the very southwest end of Lake Michigan. But there has been all this interaction always with all the Great Lakes states, and that has to do precisely with water. And as many of you know, in the early 1900s, the river was reversed. And one of the questions is, well, why was the river flow directed away from the lake? And that was to protect Lake Michigan. So some historical notes from where we are. The first settlers that came here, the first explorers, Father Marquette and Louis Joliet, they figured out that it would be nice to have a path between the Great Lakes and the Illinois River. And basically the motivation at the time was communication, was trade. And that idea kind of lingered for a long time. And finally, 200 years later, it happened. But before all of that, there was the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which started at Bridgeport and then moved on. And that canal never really worked very well, but was the reason why Chicago came to be, because Illinois didn't have enough money to build this canal. They decided to release bonds, bought the right of way, land speculators pitching money into this enterprise, and that's how Chicago started around 1833 with about 350 people. By 1860, the population of Chicago had already reached more than 100,000 people. And population growth here is very important because there were a lot of sanitation problems that started with that. And those sanitation problems had to do with the fact that each time there was a storm, all the waste from latrines, shallow wells, and whatnot ended up going into the lake, which was the main source of water. So there were many instances of cholera, like we see today in other parts of the world. That used to happen here in Chicago as well, Waterborne Disease. So the Board of Sewerage was organized in 1855. So, and after, like I just said, after each time you had a rainfall event, the water would go out, would get into the creeps, into the water intakes, and then it would come back, and people would have to drink that. So, of course, things didn't go very well. And the idea of reversing the Chicago River came along. This was have been put together by an engineer that came from Boston, Chesbrough, that had that idea, but at the time there wasn't enough funding to do this. Until there was a fairly large storm in 1885, with more than 6 inches of rain. That created a lot of problems, waterborne disease. Large percentage of the population got sick. There were a number of deaths. These numbers are always arguably how many people actually died, but there were a lot of problems, and that motivated the creation of the Chicago Sanitary District, which is today the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. And they were charged with the idea of building a canal. And you can see one of the meetings of the board, and I put down there that this might have been the first Chicago Ideas Week ever. Because they were sitting there trying to figure out, well, now what do we do? So it was a whole sequence of events, a lot of history here on how things came to be. But the important thing is that, and I'm going to have to accelerate a bit, is that things move along. The canal had to be going through a subcontinental divide, okay? And there was a lot of work, and Chicago became to be known as a school of earth moving. As you can see, people working here. A lot of the equipment that was created, that had to be developed to dig up the canal, to go through rock and all that, was later on used for the Panama Canal. And Ishan Randolph, the chief engineer, was sent there by President Roosevelt to do that. You can see what they did over the weekends. There were no Chicago architectural tour, so they could just go on these buckets. So the canal came to be. It was designed. St. Louis obviously opposed that, but the Board of Trustees went ahead and opened it, and it changed really the way the waterways work, because now there was a way to take water from the lake, use it to dilute the water in the river, and then send it down to St. Louis. That's why they were not very happy. But there were a number of controls that were created at the time, and the Supreme Court was always having to deliver on the fact that with different degrees of how much water actually Chicago could take, and today it's about 3,200 cubic feet per second, which is about 90 cubic meters per second on average. Obviously, this wasn't enough to take care of all the water, so we had to, the wastewater treatment plants came along, okay? Particularly the three of them, Calumet, the Northside plant, and then Stickney. But the population kept growing, and the challenge of urban growth was just unbelievable. So the system had to keep changing. One aspect that is very important here is that Chicago has combined sewers. So your storm sewer and your sanitary sewer are the same. And what that means is that when the capacity is overwhelmed of the system, that water goes into the river, okay? So that's a problem. Let's see if I can get this through. So you can see that there are about 375 square miles that have combined sewers. So that's a challenge, okay? So when the creation of the EPA and the Clean Water Act, solutions were searched, and the solution that came along was the construction of what the so-called the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan. And the idea of the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan is to basically create extra storage so that the water goes into these tunnels, which are 300 feet under the ground of the city, and basically contain that water there until the storm goes away. The water then can be pumped back to the wastewater treatment plant, and then is released to the river. So it's about 100 miles of tunnels under the city, okay, that follow the waterways, basically. And those tunnels are huge, and at the cost of about $3.1 billion. So the idea is that you protect the river, the waterways, and at the same time, you protect the main source of water. This to give you an idea of a tunnel boring machine. Many of these machines and this technology were then used to build a channel between England and France later on. But these are huge tunnels. You can see there that they're wondering why the head of the tunnel boring machine didn't show up where the target is. It was just a little bit skewed when you're working underground. So this is a pumping station. For this to give you an idea about scale, the reservoirs, and how much this is going to add. At the University of Illinois, we have been trying to figure out how the whole system works, and hopefully from the hydrology, the hydraulics, be able to operate the tunnels and maximize their efficiency and try to capture as much as. So the promise of Marquette and Joliet, it was actually fulfilled. But now there are new voices, you know, there are new challenges, if you wish, about reversing the Chicago River again. There are issues with invasive species, with Asian carp. There are also issues regarding water diversion. The Great Lakes states look at Illinois and Chicago in particular as a loss of water. And that's why I say that we need to really be aware of the fact that this is not an infinite source of water that we have in the Great Lakes, by no means. So this is a challenge for us. I'm out of time. And I think I'm going to leave it with this slide. But the message here is that we have been there, like the other speakers mentioned before. There was a period of time in the history of Chicago, in the history of the US, where we also had to really work very, very hard to reach a certain standard and be able to have good quality water. And I think we need to honor the source. And when we do that, and the source for us is Lake Michigan. So I'm going to leave it at that. And if you want to read more about Chicago and the history, there is a very nice book that came out not too long ago about building the canal that saved Chicago by Richard Lanyon, who happens to be sitting here. So I put a plug for him. And on that note, I thank you from the University of Illinois then.